The sun was slipping low across the horizon, bleeding gold and amber into the wide Montana sky as old rancher Samuel Cutter led his tired horse back toward the barn. The air smelled of rain-soaked earth, sweet and heavy after the storm that had hammered the valley through the night. His boots squelched in the mud and the leather reins creaked softly in his worn hands. Life out on the plains was quiet, sometimes too quiet, but it was the only life he knew and the only one he trusted. He had buried too many memories in this soil to leave it behind now. His ranch was nothing grand, just a stretch of rough land with a leaning barn, a few fences that needed mending, and a small wooden cabin that had seen better days. He lived alone now, save for a few cattle, his horse, and the wind that never seemed to stop moving across the open fields. The days came and went like a slow song, and Samuel found peace in the rhythm of work and silence. That evening, though, there was something uneasy in the air. The sky, though calm, carried a restless whisper. The river, normally a steady, lazy current that wound along the edge of his land, was roaring louder than he had ever heard it. The rain from last night must have filled the mountain streams beyond measure. Samuel frowned, his weathered face deep with concern. The river could be dangerous after a storm like that, especially near the old cedar bridge where the current narrowed and twisted between jagged rocks. He turned toward the cabin, thinking only of a warm meal and a bit of rest, when a sharp sound cut through the evening. A scream. Not the cry of an animal, but human. Small, desperate, and terrified. Samuel froze, his heart thudding hard in his chest. It came again, faint but clear enough to know it wasn't his imagination. Without a second thought, he dropped the reins, his instincts taking over. His boots splashed through the puddles as he sprinted toward the river, his breath catching in his throat. The cries grew louder with every step, mixed with the violent roar of the water. As he came over the rise near the cedar bridge, his stomach clenched at what he saw. 2 children, a boy and a girl, were caught in the current. Their small hands clawed at the surface, faces pale with panic as they were dragged down by the raging water. Pieces of debris, branches, leaves, broken boards spun around them like a whirlpool. Samuel didn't hesitate. He threw off his hat and coat, kicked away his boots, and plunged into the river. The cold hit him like a hammer, stealing his breath, but he forced his arms to move, cutting through the water with the strength of a man half his age. The current was vicious, tugging at his legs, spinning him sideways, but his eyes stayed locked on the children. The boy went under first, swallowed by the river. Samuel dove after him, the world going dark and wild beneath the surface. His hands searched blindly until they brushed against a small arm. He grabbed it, kicking hard until his head broke through the surface again. The boy gasped for air, coughing violently, and Samuel shouted over the noise of the water, "Hold on to me, kid." He could see the girl now, struggling, drifting farther away. With one arm around the boy, he fought the current, forcing his way toward her. His muscles burned, his lungs screamed for air, but he didn't stop. When he reached her, she was barely conscious, her long dark hair tangled in a branch. He tore it free, pulling her close, both children clinging to him in blind terror. Now came the hardest part. The shore seemed impossibly far away, the current pulling them sideways toward the rocks. Samuel gritted his teeth and swam with everything he had left, pushing the children ahead of him, one stroke at a time. The water slammed against him, but he refused to let go. He had lost enough in his life, he would not lose them too. At last, his boots found the riverbed. He stumbled forward, dragging the children onto the muddy bank. All 3 collapsed in the wet grass, coughing and shaking. For a moment, Samuel lay there on his back, chest heaving, staring at the sky. The clouds had broken apart, and the last light of sunset painted the horizon in deep crimson. He could hear the children crying softly beside him, the sound of life, fragile and real. When he finally sat up, the boy was clinging to the girl, his eyes wide with fear. They were both soaked to the bone, shivering violently. Their clothes were unlike anything Samuel had seen in years. Woven tunics, handmade moccasins, and beaded cords tied around their wrists. They were native children, no doubt from one of the tribes that lived miles upriver. Samuel's heart softened. They couldn't have been more than 10 or 11, scared out of their minds and far from home. "It's all right," he said gently, though his voice trembled with exhaustion. "You're safe now. You're gonna be all right." The boy looked at him, uncertain, his dark eyes darting around as if expecting danger. Samuel kept his distance, not wanting to frighten them further. He stood slowly, offered a hand, and gestured toward the cabin in the distance. "Come on. You'll freeze out here." They didn't understand his words, but his tone carried something they did understand: kindness. After a long moment, the boy nodded, helping his sister to her feet. Samuel led the way back across the field, the children following closely, their small feet sinking into the wet ground. By the time they reached the cabin, the last light had faded. Samuel ushered them inside, the smell of wood smoke and old leather filling the air. He quickly stoked the fire, adding another log until the flames danced high. The warmth spread through the small room, casting soft shadows across the wooden walls. The children huddled near the fire, still shaking. Samuel found a thick wool blanket, the only one he had, and wrapped it around them both. Their eyes followed his every move, uncertain but curious. He poured hot water into a kettle and placed it over the fire, then handed them a tin cup each filled with the steaming liquid. The girl hesitated before sipping, but when she tasted it, her eyes softened a little. Samuel smiled faintly. "Good, huh? It's just water. You need it." He watched them quietly, wondering how they had ended up in the river. There was no settlement nearby, no camp within miles. Maybe their family had been crossing the river after the storm and something went wrong. The thought made his stomach twist. If they'd been swept downstream that far, their people were probably frantic with worry. But for now, all he could do was keep them safe. He fetched some bread and jerky from his small pantry and set it down for them. They ate slowly, their small hands trembling. Every now and then the girl glanced up at him, her expression unreadable, half trust, half fear. When the fire burned low, Samuel pulled an old quilt from his bed and spread it on the floor near the hearth. "You two sleep there," he said softly. "It's warm by the fire." He pointed to himself and then the cot in the corner. "I'll sleep there. You rest." They didn't understand every word, but they caught the meaning. The boy nodded, pulling the blanket tighter around his sister. Within minutes, exhaustion overcame them both. The soft sound of their breathing filled the cabin, steady and peaceful. Samuel sat at the edge of his cot, staring into the fire. The crackling logs glowed red and orange, their light flickering across his face. He thought of his own daughter. How long it had been since he'd heard a child's laughter in this house. She'd died years ago, taken by fever before her 10th birthday. He still remembered the way she'd giggled when she'd feed the horses or chase butterflies across the pasture. Maybe that's why he had jumped in the river without a second thought. Some part of him couldn't bear to lose another child, not even a stranger's. Outside, the wind picked up again, whistling softly through the cracks in the window frame. The land was silent otherwise. No crickets, no coyotes, just the slow rhythm of the river beyond the hills. He listened to it for a long time, trying to calm the ache in his chest. As the hours passed, the fire burned down to embers. Samuel lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene in his mind. The rushing water, the children's terrified faces, the strength it had taken to fight the current. He could still feel the cold in his bones. He wondered if anyone had seen what happened, if someone was out there searching for them even now. He drifted off near dawn, his body too weary to stay awake any longer. In his half-sleep, he thought he heard the faint sound of drums echoing through the distance, deep and steady like a heartbeat. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe it was something else. When the first light of morning crept through the window, Samuel woke to find the children still asleep, their faces calm now, their breathing soft. The fire had gone out, but the room was filled with a strange quiet, like the air just before a storm. He stood slowly, stretching his stiff back, and stepped outside. The grass was damp with dew and mist clung to the edges of the field. The river, calmer now, shimmered under the pale light. Everything seemed peaceful again until he heard it, a low rhythmic sound in the distance. Not the wind this time, drums, deep and slow, coming closer. He turned his eyes toward the hills and saw faint shapes moving through the morning fog, riders, many of them, their silhouettes dark against the rising sun. Samuel's hand tightened around the silver buckle of his belt. Something told him this morning was going to change everything. The first pale light of dawn crept across the valley, soft and cold, painting the edges of the hills with silver. Samuel stirred from a restless sleep, his body heavy and aching from the rescue. The memories of last night came rushing back before his eyes were even open. The roar of the river, the weight of 2 frightened children clinging to him, the cold that had cut to his bones. He sat up slowly, the wooden floor creaking beneath him. The cabin smelled faintly of smoke and damp wool. His eyes fell on the two small figures still curled up by the hearth. The blanket he'd wrapped around them had slipped halfway off during the night, revealing their tangled dark hair and small hands clutching each other tightly even in sleep. The sight made something deep inside Samuel ache, a feeling he hadn't known in years. For a long while he just watched them breathe, the gentle rise and fall of their chests. There was peace in that rhythm, a fragile kind of peace that didn't belong in this harsh land. He remembered his daughter again, how she'd looked when she slept as a child, curls sticking to her cheeks, a smile playing faintly on her lips. Time had dulled the pain of her loss, but it had never really gone away. It just hid beneath layers of silence and work and loneliness. He sighed, rubbing his eyes, and stood. His joints protested as he moved toward the stove where the kettle from last night still sat. He poured in more water and set it over the fire, coaxing the dying embers back to life. Soon the room filled with the comforting sound of crackling flames. The boy stirred first, blinking against the morning light. He looked around the small cabin with confusion, then remembered. His gaze landed on Samuel, wary but curious. Samuel offered a small smile. "Morning, kid," he said softly. The boy didn't respond, only watched. The girl woke soon after, coughing lightly. She sat up and the blanket slid down from her shoulders. Her eyes, wide and dark, darted around the room before settling on her brother. He said something in their language, gentle, reassuring, and she nodded, though she still looked frightened. Samuel reached for a tin cup and filled it with warm water from the kettle, then handed it to the girl. "Here," he said. "Drink this." She hesitated, looking at her brother, who gave a small nod. Carefully, she took the cup from Samuel's rough hand, her tiny fingers brushing against his calloused skin. She drank slowly, and when she finished, Samuel smiled again. "Good, that'll help." He rummaged through his pantry and brought out some bread and dried fruit. "You two must be starving," he said, setting the food on the table. He motioned for them to come closer. They didn't understand his words, but they understood the gesture. The boy took a piece of bread and broke it in half, giving one part to his sister before tasting his own. The way he chewed cautiously made Samuel's throat tighten. They must not have eaten since before the storm. Outside, the sun was climbing higher, but the air remained cool. The storm had left everything soaked and glistening, the grass heavy with dew, the fences slick with rain. From where he stood, Samuel could see the river glinting like a silver snake in the distance, quiet now, as if nothing terrible had happened there. He leaned against the window frame, sipping his own cup of hot water. His mind was already turning over what to do next. The children's family would be looking for them, maybe even nearby. He'd heard stories over the years about the tribes that roamed these parts. The nearest was about a day's ride north, past the ridge. But he also knew that sometimes, when tragedy struck, anger came with it. If their people thought a white man had taken their children. He shook his head. "No," he muttered under his breath. "No one could think that." Still, the thought lingered. Behind him, the children whispered to each other in soft, musical tones. Samuel turned and watched as the girl picked at the bread, while the boy traced patterns in the table's rough wood. They looked cleaner now, though still exhausted. Their eyes, dark as river stones, had lost some of the wild fear from the night before. He decided to give them a sense of calm. He went to a shelf, pulled down a small wooden horse he'd carved years ago, and set it on the table. It was old, smooth from years of being handled. His daughter had loved it once. The boy looked at the carving with wide eyes. Samuel nudged it toward him. "Go on," he said. The boy hesitated, then reached out, turning the little horse over in his hands. A faint smile touched his lips. Samuel's chest warmed. He didn't need to speak their language to understand gratitude. Time passed slowly. The morning sunlight grew stronger, filtering through the cracks in the cabin walls. The children played quietly near the fire while Samuel went outside to check the animals. The air was fresh, clean in a way that only comes after a storm. His horse lifted its head when he approached, snorting softly. As he tended to the chores, refilling the troughs, checking the fence posts, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Every time the wind rustled the grass, he found himself glancing toward the ridge. It was too still, too quiet. Out here, silence meant something. When he went back inside, the children looked up. The boy had the horse in one hand, and the girl was sitting cross-legged beside him, humming softly. Samuel smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes this time. Something in his gut told him that today would not be like any other day. By midday, he'd decided he'd ride north come morning, take the children toward the direction of the tribal lands. It was the right thing to do. He couldn't keep them here forever, not without risking misunderstanding or worse. But maybe, he thought, they'd find him before then. He didn't have to wait long. It started as a faint vibration underfoot, so light he almost thought he imagined it. Then came the sound, distant at first, like thunder rolling over the mountains. A steady rhythm, deep and deliberate. Drums. The sound was unmistakable. Samuel froze, the cup in his hand trembling slightly. The children looked up instantly, eyes wide with recognition. They spoke quickly to each other, their voices rising. The boy rushed to the door, peering out through the small crack in the frame. "What is it?" Samuel asked, though he already knew. The boy turned to him, his expression torn between hope and fear. The sound grew louder, closer. The beat of drums mixed now with another sound, the thud of hooves. Many of them. The air itself seemed to vibrate with it. Samuel's pulse quickened. He stepped outside, shielding his eyes against the sun. At first, all he saw was a shimmer of movement across the misty fields. Then the shapes appeared, riders, their silhouettes emerging one by one through the fog. He counted at least 100. Warriors. They came in formation, moving with a fluid grace that spoke of discipline and purpose. The morning light glinted off spears and polished metal ornaments. Some carried banners of woven fabric that fluttered in the breeze. The sound of the drums came from the rear, deep and resonant, echoing across the land like a heartbeat. Samuel's horse snorted and pulled at the reins, uneasy. He felt the same way. He stood still, his mind racing. He wasn't a man easily frightened, but this was something else entirely. A force of nature, unstoppable, ancient, and proud. He turned his head toward the cabin. The children had stepped outside, their small hands gripping the doorframe. The girl's eyes were filled with tears, but they weren't tears of fear. They were tears of recognition. Samuel's chest tightened. Their father. Their people. The riders stopped about 50 yards from the cabin. For a long moment there was silence, broken only by the steady snort of the horses. Then one rider dismounted, a tall man with broad shoulders and long braided hair streaked with silver. He wore a cloak of fur and feathers, and his face was painted with the solemn markings of a leader. His gaze was sharp, steady, and commanding. Even at that distance, Samuel could feel the weight of his presence. The chief, because there was no doubt that's what was. Samuel raised his hand slightly, palms open, showing he was unarmed. "I mean no harm," he called out, his voice rough but steady. "Your children, they're safe." The chief didn't respond. He stopped about 10 paces away, scanning the scene. The cabin, the firewood, the children at the door. Then his gaze settled on Samuel. The silence stretched so long that Samuel felt his heart hammering in his chest. Then, the girl cried out, a single word, her father's name perhaps, and broke into a run. The boy followed, both of them sprinting across the grass. The chief dropped to one knee, arms outstretched, and gathered them both into his embrace. The warriors behind him lowered their heads in silent reverence. Samuel exhaled, relief flooding through him. It was over. They were safe. But when the chief rose, still holding the children, his expression was unreadable. He looked at Samuel again, long and hard. There was no anger in his eyes, but there was something powerful there, something ancient, something Samuel could not name. The chief handed the children to one of the warriors and began walking toward Samuel once more. The drums had stopped now. The valley was silent except for the soft sound of his boots in the grass. Samuel's instinct told him to step back, but he didn't. He stood his ground, heart pounding. Whatever would come next, he would face it like a man who had done the right thing. The chief stopped a few feet away. His voice, when he finally spoke, was deep and calm. The words were foreign, heavy, with meaning Samuel couldn't understand. But then slowly the chief switched to broken English, rough but clear enough. "You pulled my children from the death river," he said. "You faced the water when others would watch and turn away." Samuel nodded once, not trusting his voice. The chief studied him for a long moment, then turned to look at his people waiting in the mist. He said something in his own tongue, a command of some kind. The warriors dismounted silently and formed a line. One by one they raised their weapons, not in threat but in salute. Samuel felt his throat tighten. The sight was humbling beyond words. The chief placed his hand over his heart, then gestured toward Samuel in a gesture of profound respect. "You saved what no man can replace," he said softly. "The river took much from us this year, but today it gave something back." The word struck deep. Samuel swallowed hard, his eyes burning. The chief turned and motioned for his people to prepare. The children waved to Samuel from horseback, smiling for the first time. As the riders began to move away, the chief paused and looked back one final time. "You are not forgotten," he said, and then with the rising sun behind them, the riders disappeared into the morning mist, leaving Samuel standing alone in the field, the echoes of drums fading into silence. His heart forever changed. The wind was rising again, soft but full of life, carrying the scent of wet earth and cedar smoke across the valley. Samuel stood outside his cabin, the damp grass cold under his bare feet as the riders drew closer. What had first been a blur of shadows in the fog now became a wall of movement and color. Faces painted with ochre and ash, feathers trailing behind proud horses, and the dull glint of metal and bone ornaments catching the morning light. He had seen many things in his 60 years on the plains, but never this. 100 warriors moving as one, silent as ghosts, powerful as the storm that had raged through the night before. His breath came shallow, every sense sharpened. The world had narrowed to the sound of hooves and the weight of eyes that watched him from across the open land. Each rider carried himself with poise and dignity, their presence radiating something that felt almost holy. These were not men on the hunt. They were protectors, fathers, brothers, answering the call of blood and kin. Behind him, inside the cabin, Samuel could hear the faint rustling of movement. The children. They were awake now, whispering to each other in urgent tones. He turned his head slightly, enough to see the boy standing by the doorframe, his small face pale but alight with recognition. The girl clutched the blanket around her shoulders, trembling, her eyes filled with something more than fear. It was longing. Samuel raised a steadying hand toward them. "It's all right," he said softly, though his voice carried little conviction. "They've come for you." The boy looked at him for a long moment, his lips pressed tight, then stepped out of the cabin, dragging his sister along. Samuel wanted to stop him, to protect him, but he knew it wasn't his place anymore. Those children didn't belong to him. He had only been their keeper for one night, one fragile night between life and death. The riders slowed as they approached, spreading out in a wide half-circle that enclosed the cabin and the small field before it. Their horses snorted and pawed at the ground, nostrils flaring. Not a single man spoke. The only sound was the rhythmic creak of saddles and the rustle of wind through the tall grass. Samuel's hands were open at his sides, his heart thudding so hard he could feel it in his throat. He'd left his rifle inside deliberately, not wanting to show any sign of aggression. Still, a man facing 100 warriors could never feel at ease, no matter how noble their cause. At the center of the group, one rider dismounted, a tall man wrapped in a cloak of wolf fur, his long black hair streaked with gray. The way the others looked at him told Samuel all he needed to know. This was the chief, the father of the two children. He stood perfectly still as the man walked toward him. There was no rush in his steps, no visible anger, only calm power like the stillness before lightning strikes. His eyes were sharp, unreadable, and when he stopped a few feet away, Samuel could feel the force of his presence like heat from a fire. The chief said nothing at first. His gaze swept over Samuel, the cabin, the river in the distance, and finally rested on his children. The girl gave a small cry and tore away from Samuel's side, running across the grass. The boy followed, calling out in a voice thick with relief. They collided with their father, and he dropped to one knee to catch them, gathering both into his arms. For a moment, everything stopped, the world, the sound of horses, the wind itself. The sight of that reunion carved deep into Samuel's chest. The chief buried his face in the children's hair, murmuring something in a low voice. He held them as if to make sure they were real, that they hadn't vanished into the same river that had tried to take them. The warriors behind him shifted slightly, their tension melting into something softer. Even they, stoic and disciplined, couldn't hide their relief. When the chief finally looked up again, his eyes were wet but fierce. He whispered something to one of his men, who nodded and took the children a few steps back. Then the chief rose, standing tall once more, and turned his full attention to Samuel. The two men stared at each other across the small stretch of grass. One weathered by years of wind and solitude, the other marked by leadership and the weight of generations. They were two different worlds meeting in the quiet dawn. Samuel swallowed hard. "They fell into the river," he began, his voice rough. "I heard them crying for help. The current was strong. They'd have drowned if I hadn't." He stopped. The chief wasn't angry. He wasn't accusing. He was simply listening. There was something unnerving about the way his eyes held Samuel's, as if he could see right through him, beyond words, into the truth of things. The chief spoke, his English halting but clear. "You went into the river?" Samuel nodded once. "Aye. Pulled them out just before dark." The chief's jaw tightened and his gaze dropped for a moment. "The river has taken many," he said quietly. "It is hungry this season." Samuel said nothing. The wind carried the sound of the river faintly through the air, its voice softer now, almost guilty. The chief stepped closer until he was just a few feet away. The warriors didn't move. His presence was overwhelming up close. Every scar on his face told a story. Every line spoke of years of loss and strength. "You could have turned away," he said. "No one would have blamed you. But you did not." Samuel met his eyes. "No one turns away from children in need. Not out here." Something flickered in the chief's expression, something between respect and sorrow. He reached into the folds of his cloak and drew out a small pouch made of tanned hide. He untied it and sprinkled a few grains of red earth onto the ground between them. Samuel didn't understand the gesture, but it felt sacred. The chief spoke in his own tongue, a few words that rolled like thunder, then looked at Samuel again. "For the earth," he said, tapping his chest, "for witness. You did what is right. My people will not forget." Samuel felt his throat tighten. "I didn't do it for thanks." The chief's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but something close. "No, that is why it matters." Behind them, the children watched quietly. The boy held his sister's hand, whispering softly, though his eyes never left Samuel. There was a sadness in his gaze that struck Samuel harder than any word could. Then, slowly, the chief turned toward his people. He lifted one arm and made a gesture, a motion of the hand that Samuel couldn't decipher. At once the warriors began to dismount, their movements fluid, synchronized. They stood in a line facing the rancher, their spears and bows raised high. It was not a threat. It was an honor. The chief placed his hand on Samuel's shoulder. His grip was strong, but it carried warmth. "When you hear the wind in this valley," he said, his voice low and reverent, "remember this day." The river did not take, it gave. Samuel could only nod, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. The chief stepped back and motioned for his children. The girl ran to him, climbing into his arms, while the boy hesitated for a moment. He looked back at Samuel and with small trembling hands held out the wooden horse Samuel had given him the night before. Samuel froze. The toy had been carved years ago, a relic of his daughter's laughter. Seeing it again in that boy's hands tore open every scar of the past. The boy pressed it into Samuel's palm and whispered something in his native tongue. Samuel didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. The boy's small eyes were bright and earnest, filled with gratitude. Samuel nodded slowly, closing his hand around the wooden horse. "You keep it," he tried to say, but the boy shook his head firmly, stepping back toward his father. The chief watched the exchange in silence, his face unreadable. When the boy returned to his side, he lifted the girl onto the horse and swung up behind her. The boy climbed onto another horse beside him. The drums began again, faint and rhythmic, carried by the warriors at the rear of the formation. The chief raised his hand and the riders began to move. The sound of 100 hooves rolled across the valley like distant thunder, echoing off the cliffs. As they passed, each warrior turned slightly toward Samuel and lowered his head. It was an act of respect, one that made his heart pound with a mix of humility and disbelief. He stood frozen, watching as the long line of riders moved through the mist and into the rising sun. The last to leave was the chief. He turned his horse at the edge of the field and looked back one final time. The morning light framed him in gold and white. He raised his arm in a gesture Samuel somehow knew meant farewell, or perhaps something deeper. Samuel raised his own hand in return, and then they were gone. The sound of their departure lingered for a long time, fading slowly until only the whisper of the wind remained. Samuel stood there for what felt like hours, the wooden horse still warm in his hand. The sun climbed higher, burning away the fog, revealing the river glinting peacefully in the distance. He finally turned toward his cabin. Inside, everything was just as he'd left it. The fire burned low, the blanket still rumpled near the hearth, the cups on the table half empty. The silence inside was heavier now, deeper. He set the wooden horse on the mantel beside an old photograph of his daughter, faded and curling at the edges. For the first time in years, Samuel smiled. Not the small, tired smiles he gave out of habit, but a real one, slow and full of life. He whispered softly to the empty room, "Rest easy, little one. You're not alone anymore." Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint echo of drums one last time through the valley, deep, steady, and eternal. Samuel stepped outside to listen, his heart calm and full. The river gleamed in the sunlight, peaceful now, as if it too remembered. He closed his eyes and breathed it in, the world around him vast and alive, the air thick with promise. The warriors were gone, but their presence lingered, a reminder that even in the loneliest places, kindness still carried across worlds.